Tonight, we discuss this amazing opportunity we have every time we do the commandment. Check it out. We are in chapter 35. And in chapter 35, we are focusing on how incredibly significant is the actual action, doing the commandment physically, lighting those candles for the Shabbat, for the Shabbos, for the holidays, having a mezuzah on your door, putting on the tefillin, giving the charity, dressing modestly. The very physical actions, they do something nothing else does, which is they allow your body to have the divine presence. That on your body is what we call the Shechina, the Hashra'as Hashchina. And that Hebrew term, the Rebbe decoded to mean the revelation of the oneness of God. And we explained, because we're talking about the oneness of God, it can actually only be with the action commandments, because with everything else, there's a bit, or perhaps more than a bit, of you involved. And if you're involved, then it's not absolute oneness of God. There's oneness of God plus you, so it's not really oneness of God. But with the action, it's just, this is God's will. That's why it's being done. It's nothing but the revelation of God's will. You're the facilitator of God's will. So your involvement is just expressing God's will, God's reality. And that's why this commandment can become the oil to feed the flame of God's presence on your body, on the wick. The wick meaning God's presence on your body. And the last thing that we were discussing 2 weeks ago was, well, what about Torah study? And we reminded ourselves how incredible Torah study is and how the fusion, the oneness we achieve when we study Torah is like nothing else. And it is like nothing else. There's no way our soul can get as close to God as the soul enjoys when studying Torah. But that's the soul, not the body. Studying Torah's cerebral, studying Torah's going on in your mind. And of course, I mean, your lips move and your hands move and your eyes are involved and your ears might be involved, your voice might be involved, but it's still primarily intellectual. It's not as much a full body experience. And as such, it's not affecting the body the same way. So your soul can get the closest to God through the study of Torah. But your body receives the Shekhinah, the oneness of God, when you do the action commandment. And that's about what we were up to. So if we look inside, we are on page Memhe, and we are 2, 4, 7 lines from the top. Actually, the middle of the phrase. Let's go back. But we don't just want God on our soul, even though it's really great and amazing and terrific and stupendous, and we're so excited. And that's why everyone comes to this class, because we are right now studying Torah. Our souls are enjoying the greatest possible oneness with God, which is unbelievable. And our soul is like, whoa, the happiest, the best. But it's not really affecting my body. I want to also affect my body. Why do I care so much to affect my body? There's many reasons. But very simply, you could say, that's why I'm here. We are not in this world to elevate our souls to higher and higher planes of divinity. Not that it doesn't happen. Obviously, through the journey on planet Earth, our souls ascend higher and higher, much higher than they would if they remained above. But that doesn't make a difference. The soul did not leave this celestial abode to come to planet Earth to go higher. She came because God has a mission. God has a need. He volunteered. We're all in the Peace Corps. Every one of us volunteered for this mission. And of course, everyone has very specific missions to do, specific tasks in this world. But overarching, we all have the mission of refining our body and our animal soul. We have many layers of mission. We also all have the mission to bring redemption. And we also have the very personal areas of our soul that maybe were not accomplished in previous lifetimes and have to be done now. Maybe it's a commandment we never did, or something we transgressed and never rectified. So obviously we have layers and layers of why we are here. But definitely one of the overarching pieces is to refine the body, to refine the animal soul. Because the godly soul is refined. The godly soul is godly. We're not here to refine the godly soul. In the course of our activities, she gets higher and higher and higher. But the purpose from that perspective is the body and the animal soul. So therefore, when we understand that there's nothing that more infuses my soul with God in the study of Torah, that's amazing, to give my soul a lot of strength to now go and do her mission. And her mission is not the godly soul. Her mission is to change the body and the animal soul. So that's why the Rebbe is saying, well, this is amazing, and we're so excited that my godly soul is soaring high with the study of Torah, and we are excited, and I highly encourage it. But we can't stop there. With all this excitement, with all this inspiration, with your soul being charged and well fed, because the only food of your soul is Torah. So now that your soul is well fed, charged, energized, go out and change the body and the animal soul. That's a very critical reason why you're in this world. Well, how do we do that? The actions, the action commandments. Because the action commandments bring God's presence, the revelation of his oneness on your body and your soul. We don't need it on our soul, because we're not doing it for our soul. We're doing this to change our bodies. And that's exactly how it happened. Now, we get all this. We get that the study of Torah is amazing for my soul, but doesn't help my body as much, and my body needs a lot of help. We get that's actually one of the reasons why I'm in this world, a very critical reason why I'm in this world. We get that doing the action commandments does it. I'm doing the commandment with my body, and therefore my body is now subsumed in the commandment, subsumed in God's flames, part of the commandment, and enjoying the revelation of God's presence. But why is my animal soul even a part of this script? What does it have to do with anything? Because traditionally, I think of my animal soul as this contest, this battle. It says so in Tanya. Goes back to a metaphor, a parable of King Solomon. There's two kings and one city, and it's a head-on collision. The city is me, and the two kings is a godly soul and the animal soul, and they're always fighting. So when I'm doing good, am I saying, and this refines, and this brings God's presence on my animal soul? What does she do with anything? She lost this battle, thankfully. Was she involved? And now the Alter Rebbe teaches us, and I began discussing at the end of 2 classes ago, this amazing innovation that we never knew until. We had to wait till chapter 35 of Tanya to find this out. 34 chapters, we thought. 34 chapters, we thought. There's a godly soul, there's an animal soul, they're in conflict. One's up, one's down, one's up, one's down. And that's all true. It's all true. Everything you thought is true. But there's a deeper truth. And the deeper truth, as I just stated, is not only am I here, I meaning godly soul, because that's the true I. Not only am I here to refine this body, I'm here to refine this animal soul. How do I refine the animal soul? Because every time I serve God, she's actually part of that story. We explained that my godly soul is so godly, can't really interface with a physical body, but it needs to. When there's that battle and the godly soul wins, and now my mind is full of Torah, that godly soul has to get my human brain to think Torah. When there's that battle and the godly soul wins, and I'm being kind and generous, that godly soul has to reach my mouth for me to say the right words, my face for all those sympathetic, expressive facial movements, my heart to feel that love for another person. Godly soul has to reach my body, but my body is very far from a godly soul. So every time the godly soul wins the battle with the animal, she's also kidnapping the animal and using her as a perhaps unwilling tool, an unwilling accomplice, but through the animal, she's reaching the body. It's like the godly soul is so spiritual. Well, the animal soul is also spiritual. It's an angel. Your animal soul, your inclination is considered an angelic force, a spiritual force, serving God by tempting us, serving God by being the catalyst for us to do wrong, so we overcome. But this is a spiritual energy. So my godly soul can relate to a spiritual energy. And this spiritual energy of my animal soul can definitely relate to a body, because in this situation, this spiritual energy is moving in this direction of the body down to the desires and pleasures of this world. So the animal soul and the body have a lot in common, but the animal soul and the godly soul also have something in common, because they're both godly spiritual energies. You can't dissect the body and pull out an animal soul any more than you can pull out a godly soul. They're both spiritual energy. In the perfect tzaddik, the most righteous Jew, when he has completely eradicated the angel called the evil inclination, which is also an angelic force, the animal soul becomes subsumed in the godly soul. The animal soul and the godly soul are one entity serving God. That's the ultimate vision for our animal soul, and for all of us, God willing, by the redemption, we'll all be on this level, because there won't be any evil anymore. So once there's no evil, what's going to happen with my animal soul? It's going to become part of my godly soul. It's going to give me so much energy, so much charge. An animal is a lot of brute strength, very fast. It's going to have me racing toward God. Like it has that perfect tzaddik, the holiest, most godly person, racing toward God. That's the ultimate vision. But now, as I journey, through the trenches here, every time I struggle, and often my animal soul opposes me, and I overcome, and I win with God's help. I then use the animal soul as my facilitator to reach the body. So the godly soul can talk to the animal soul, both souls, both spiritual, and the animal soul can definitely communicate with the body. So from the godly soul to the animal soul to the body. And then the mind is studying Torah. Because my godly soul won, you guys showed up to class, you're focused, I only see a bunch of screens, but I'm sure you're only thinking about this Tanya at this moment. So your godly soul won, and therefore that means the animal soul is now being utilized to reach the cells of your mind, to reach the human brain material, and that the human power of thought be thoughts of Torah. So the godly soul's power of thought, engaging the animal soul's power of thought, is then invested in the human power of thought. So my mind is thinking God's will and wisdom. My mind is thinking Torah. And that happens with every single godly thing we ever do, we ever have done, we ever are doing, we ever will do. Every single opportunity of serving God is a process of grasping that animal soul and coercing it to be the facilitator, to be the intermediary between the godly and the body. Which means every time you serve God, your animal soul is getting a bit better. She's getting a bit charred of her impurities. She's getting a bit more refined. And remember, that's part of my overarching mission. The godly soul didn't come for personal refinement. There's a body that has to be refined, and there's an animal soul that has to be refined. And every time I serve God, my body and my animal soul are changing, are shifting. It's a lifetime journey, but step by step, they're both becoming more and more godly. Okay, so now we read some of this inside. But in order to draw down the light, the radiance of the divine presence of God's oneness, also on the body and the animal soul, as we just explained, and when we say animal soul, that's not a very nice term. Oh, you're an animal. So we have a nicer term for it when we're talking about it in her intermediary role. Nefesh hachiyunis. Chiyuni means vital, which sort of goes back to the core positive task of the animal, again, as the intermediary from the godly to the body, to actually give life to the body. The godly soul is the source of all life. But again, how could a godly soul talk to a body? So the godly soul is using the animal soul to give life to the body. That's what we mean by the vital soul. The animal soul in her higher dimension, when she's the tool of the godly soul, allowing the godly to impact the body. Hamluveshes, the gufa mamish, that's literally engarbed in the body. Sha'az, that then kayachago, mamish, literally the power of the body, that's now invested in this action, whatever this godly action is. And again, we're saying action because, of course, when I study Torah, my godly soul is hijacking my animal soul to be the intermediary for my brain to learn Torah. But that's not accomplishing the goal of this chapter. What we're talking about in this chapter is bringing the oneness of God on the body. So then we're talking about an action, any commandment of action you can think of, and we do them all day long. Nichlab or Havaya, this moment, the body and the animal soul to a certain degree is comprised in this light of God, Viritsono, and his will, and it becomes completely one to a certain degree. We said when we study Torah, my soul and God are so one, we can't even separate. So this is a lesser one, because it's not a godly soul we're talking about. It's an animal soul and a physical body. But still, there's a oneness here between the body, the animal soul, and God through this action. And this is utilizing the lowest garment of the three garments of my godly soul, meaning my godly soul has three means of expression, three ways she interacts with the world around her. The world around her could mean me, or it could mean outside of me, but even me is the world around the godly soul. So it's her power of thought, her power of speech, emotion, her power of action. The power of thought is the most intimate power. It's the most refined power. The power of speech and emotion is less than that, but also more spiritualized. And then the lowest power is that power of action. But every time I'm doing an action commandment, it's the power of action of the godly soul that I'm utilizing. So right now, again, the most simple classic example, I'm taking money and putting it in a cherry box, or using my hand and writing a check and giving it to someone as a donation. I am using my godly soul's power of action, which is now seizing control of my animal soul's power of action, which is then utilizing the power of action of my human hand, and then using my hand, all be invested in this commandment. So we have the godly soul's power of action. We have the animal soul. We have the animal soul's power of action. We have the human power of action. And we have the physical hand. We have 6 layers that are all working together. When I put that coin in the charity box, when I write that check, when I use my hands to light the candles, all of those layers are being affected by God's energy that's coming because I am right now embodying his will. He has a will. Charity needs to be given. I'm an embodiment of that. He has a will. The Shabbos has to be welcomed by the Shabbos candles. I'm embodying that. He has a will. There should be mezuzah on your doorpost. When we put them up, I'm embodying that. So all 6 layers of self, my godly soul, my power of action, animal soul, her power of action, my body, her power of action, all 6 layers are all, not all to the exact same degree, but they are all part of the commandment, and therefore they're all affected by this light of God that's coming because of the pure, selfless, it is only God's will, commandment that is being done. And again, very practically, this should give you a sense of like, wow, I didn't know what I accomplished when I do these simple, easy actions. I had no clue. It's all happening every time you do any of these actions. We are very powerful people, and we have tremendous opportunity to really make a tremendous change on the spiritual, and of course from the spiritual in the physical reality as well. And then surely, the power of that vital, remember, animal soul in the body, literally, which is its energy is klipas noiga. Now, klipas noiga is a term we, of course, have used many times. But for anyone unfamiliar with it, just to recap this concept, there are 3 channels through which energy comes into this world. God's divine energy. There's a channel called Kedusha, which means straight godliness. And then there's the other side, which subdivides into a channel called Klipos Timeos, the impure Klipa. A Klipa means a husk, a shell. The impure shards, husks, shells, impure because they're barriers around the godliness that I cannot get through to access the godliness. And klipas noiga. Klipas noiga, the klipa, it's a shell, it's a husk, it's a barrier, but it's noga. Noga means somewhat translucent. I see the shine through the shell. So kedusha, straight godliness, it's straight, like your godly soul. Klipas timeos are energizing things that God forbids. Anything forbidden in this world is vitalized by klipas timeos. And klipas noiga is anything in this world which is not innately godly and not innately forbidden. Anything permissible in this world is energized by klipas timeos. Again, the klipa, it's a shell, it's a barrier. I don't see God straight through it, but it's no God. I can access that energy. I can see it. I see the glimmers, and I could therefore utilize it to serve God. And when I utilize it, I shift it from klipas noiga to the higher dimension, kedusha. Like the shell gets discarded, and the inner light can now shine directly, which means it's kedusha. So the 2 items that are most significant to me of klipas noiga is my body and my animal soul. My body is klipas noiga. My animal soul is klipas noiga. My evil inclination is klipas timeos. But we're not talking about the evil inclination. Shayvet, my body and my animal soul. They are both klipas noiga, and would be most bananas, oranges, apples, furniture, anything. There are many items of this world that are klipas noga. They're not forbidden and they're not godly. All klipas noiga. Many, many, many items of this world. When we get into our actions, it already becomes a little more subtle, because then become usually more holy or forbidden. But of the items of this world, there are so many things God permits. And they're all klipas noiga. So at this moment, when I'm doing this very godly thing, whatever that very godly thing is, I'm making kosher food, specifically deliberately kosher. I am not mixing milk and meat. I am making the food kosher. I'm using kosher items. I am making my meal kosher, which is an effort, which is a focus. And I'm doing this because God has a will for a Jew to eat kosher. So when I'm doing that, there's a tremendous energy of God that's on my body. I'm doing an action for him, the action of kosher. And my body is now the wick for his light, for the light of his oneness. And it's also affecting my animal soul, as we now understand why, because I explained how the animal soul is really there between my godly soul and my body when I am doing this act of eating, preparing kosher. So as such, it's going to be affected as well. Now we're going to read now how. So surely the power of the animal soul, of the vital soul, literally in the body from klipas noiga, it is a level that could be utilized for godliness. Again, that's the point of klipas noiga. Anything God forbids, klipas tameos, I can't touch. God said, don't eat this. I can't eat it to serve God. God said, don't do this. I can't do this to serve God. God said, don't wear this. I can't wear this to serve God. But this God permits. Now I have the challenge of eating it for God, of wearing it for God, of using it for God. And every time I do, I take that klipas noiga item and I shift it. The shell falls away, the godliness is revealed, and it becomes an item of kedusha, of straight godliness. And in a sense, that is exactly what's happening, not only to my body, but also to my animal soul. Nishafeh me'ra l'tov. It's being transformed from evil to good, because my animal soul in general, we think of as like more on the side of the evil inclination. We know when Mashiach comes, our animal souls will be part of our godly soul. By the perfect tzaddik, the most holy, righteous individual, the animal soul is part of the godly soul. But for us, most of the time now, our animal soul is under the control of that other king, of that evil inclination. And the evil inclination is pure, absolute evil, klipas tameos. So generally, it's in the side of bad. But right now, I'm serving God, and she's part of the process. So it becomes transformed from evil to good, to godly. Now, if you look precisely what the Rebbe said here, the Rebbe didn't say the animal soul. The Rebbe said the power of the animal soul. Remember, we said there's a godly soul and her power of action. The animal soul and her power of action. The power of action of the body and the physical body. All 6 layers. So there's the animal soul herself, that entity, and there's her power of action. Like right now, I'm doing an action. So she's engaging her power of action, unwillingly, but she's doing it to facilitate the commandment. So that power of action, which is not the animal soul herself, but the expression of the animal soul, literally shifts from evil to godly for the duration of the commandment. Comprised in godliness, like a godly soul is comprised in godliness, like your body at this moment is comprised in godliness, that part of your body invested in the commandment, so too this power of the animal soul is comprised within godliness at this moment, literally as you do the commandment. Because she's what's making it happen. She's the facilitator. Through her, the commandment is being done. And therefore, she is right now part of the godliness, just as your godly soul is part of the godliness, just as your body is part of the godliness. This power of the animal soul is also part of the godliness. Shabil ado, because without it, without this power of the animal soul, the godly soul won't be able to impact the body at all. No language of communication between the two of them. No way to talk, no way to interface. So this power of the animal soul, emanating from the animal soul, is actually a very significant player here every single time we serve God. And imagine what's happening, like without you even intending. You're refining yourself without thinking about it. You're thinking, oh, I have to give this person charity. I want to give this person charity. Oh, I'm going to make sure this food is kosher and I'm having my kosher pots and I'm not mixing it with the whatever, the milk and the meat and their spices. I'm pouring them into my hand. I pour them into my pot directly and everything has kosher certification and all the myriads and myriads of actions we do to prepare kosher food. Think about your animal soul at all. You might be thinking about your godly soul. Oh, I'm serving God now. Oh, this is what my godly soul wants. You might not, but you definitely aren't thinking about your animal soul. You might be thinking about your body. Oh, my body's eating the way God wants a Jewish body to eat. But you're definitely not thinking about your animal soul. But without any thought, every single time you serve God, she's there. She's part of the process. And she's changing and refining herself every single moment. It's an amazing benefit that happens without any extra effort on our part. Imagine what we would be like if it didn't happen. Because look at how much refinement our animal soul is receiving unwittingly every single time we serve God. So now the Rebbe is explaining why. Why am I saying that without the animal soul, hey, nothing good would be going on here? Ruchnis, because the animal soul is pure spiritual. But guf gashmi v'chumri. And our bodies are physical, and not only physical, but coarse physicality. No language of communication between them. And the intermediary between the two, what can talk both languages, this is the animal soul, the vital soul, engarbed in the blood of the person, in his heart, in all of his body. That's all animal soul. So it very much can talk the language of your body. It's very engarbed in your body. But it can also talk the language of the soul because it's a spiritual entity. It too is a soul. It too is spiritual. So it can communicate with the godly soul. They're both spiritual. It talks to the body. It's in the body's very blood. It's the life of the body, the blood of the body, throughout the body, throughout your bloodstream. There's animal soul. So it is a wonderful communicator between the two when it's doing right. And every time you serve God, unwittingly, unwantingly, coerced, it's doing right. But now you could say, wait a minute, this sounds like such a story. It sounds like a fantasy. Every time I serve God, there's my animal soul, part of the story. Well, not exactly, the Rebbe said. As I told you, the Rebbe was very precise in his words before. There's the animal soul, and then there's her power of expression. Right now we're studying Torah. So now we all know, my godly soul is using her power of thought, hijacking my animal soul and her power of thought to facilitate with the power of thought and the human cells of intellect. That's what's happening, all 6 layers. So the power of the animal soul, if it's the power of thought or speech or action or emotion, whatever power is being utilized by the godly for the duration of that commandment is godly, is completely part of the godly act. The animal soul herself is a little bit more remote. And within the animal soul, we have the core animal of the animal soul, which is the emotions. Meaning the animal soul, like the godly, is comprised of 3 intellectual powers and 7 emotion. Unlike the godly, the intellect of the animal soul is a little small. It's an animal, small brains. The major thrust in an animal is its emotions. And the major energy of our animal soul, the core of our animal soul, is emotional as well. And these emotions are like, not really going in the godly soul's direction, but we won. We're learning Tanya right now. You won. You're giving charity. You're eating kosher. You're dressing modestly. You won. So the power of the animal soul is being utilized to communicate and interface and create this action. And she's part of godliness. The animal soul herself, the core energy of the animal soul, those negative emotions are like sort of fuming and kicking and screaming, but can't really deal with it. So they're not totally good and part of the godliness as this is going on, but they're affected as well, as we'll now learn what happened. And even though the essence of the animal soul in the heart, which means her negative emotions, are not part of godliness, no, they're not. But mikol makom, nevertheless, me'achar diskaf in the kedusha, since they are being crushed by the godliness, we won. It's crushed. Uba'al korchan oinin amen, and unwillingly say, I acquiesce. Okay, I'm doing this. Umaskimin, and agree. Umisratzin lasiyas hamitzvah, they are acquiescing to doing the commandment. Through the intensification of the godly soul in the mind over the heart, because the mind naturally rules the heart. The godly soul's fortress is the mind. The animal soul's fortress is the heart. So when the godly soul is invested, is focused, is charged, she's winning. And of course, God always comes in to help. So for sure, she's winning. And that's why we can serve God as we do. Because our godly soul's in our mind, the mind rules the heart, and God helps. So when all this is going on, the animal soul is like, I don't really want to do this, but I have no choice. Yes, okay, I agree. Sort of like that. So what's going on with the evil core energy of your animal? The Rebbe says two things, sort of like in exile, sort of like in sleep. Now, we learned a long time ago in chapter 12 that when the Benoni is praying and he's accessing the enormous lights above, what's called Moichen de Gadlus, this enormous energy of God that one can access during the morning daily prayers, when that energy of God is shining on his soul, the animal soul goes to sleep. The animal soul checks out. The animal soul says, I cannot handle this. Like if you can imagine, if it's a noisy room and you have a very small infant, and a lot of noise, the infant, we see sometimes at least, sometimes they just act the commotion. But sometimes if there's a lot of noise, the infant just like checks out, goes to sleep. You're like, oh my gosh, how can they sleep in all this noise? No, that's the point. They're sleeping because they can't handle the noise. So that's what's happening to the animal soul when a person is praying for real and accessing God's intense energy, and the animal soul says, I'm out of here. I can't deal with this. Wake me up when this is over. That happens every day in the morning when one prays and really accesses this energy. Now, what we're doing now is not as intense as that, because this could be anything. Literally, you put the coin in the charity box. You're writing that check and handing it to someone or a stranger. You're looking through your clothing and you're discarding a skirt because it got a little too tight and a little too snug and a little too short. You're doing simple actions. You're not connecting with this high energy of God that's so intense. Your animal soul says, get me out of here. But still, every one of these simple actions is not very simple. Every one of these simple actions is drawing down the Shekhinah, the presence, the revelation of God's oneness on your body. And your animal soul is part of the process. So therefore, a certain part of it, like its core evil, is like going to sleep. Because that core evil of the emotions can't really handle this godliness at all. Its higher levels, what we might loosely call the more intellect aspect of the animal soul, which sometimes has a different name, the intellectual soul, it's in like a state of exile. Exile meaning not that it's going anywhere, but exile implies a situation when you're not your own boss, when something else is controlling you, when you're under a foreign force. So at this moment, the foreign force for the animal soul is the godly soul that's in control. So again, the godly soul's power of expression is right there within all the godliness, another layer in the layers of the commandment being done, and is fused with this godly energy. And the animal soul herself, the core piece of it, the most intense evil, is sleeping till this is over. And the less evil layers are there, but in a state of exile, because they're not doing what they want, because they don't want to do the commandment, but they're doing it. So even now in this partial sleep, partial exile, she is being affected by what's going on. Not as much as that power of hers, that's literally part of the godliness, so, but in a more like encompassing fashion. Imagine if you, a metaphor sages give, not specifically for this, but it's a similar concept, is like if you walk into a perfume store and you walk out, or you even walk by a perfume store perhaps, and the scents like sort of cling to you a little. Now, you didn't spray anything on yourself. You weren't going to buy anything. You just looked in for a second and walked out. Just walked by and the door was open. So there's a certain perfume that's now part of you in a certain peripheral way because you were part of it. You were there on a certain level. So that's sort of like what's going on to your animal soul. Her power is really becoming part of the godliness. So she's totally affected by the experience. And the animal soul herself is also peripherally being affected, being perfumed by the experience as well. Okay, and therefore, there is no barrier. There is nothing preventing the revelation of God's oneness on the body at this moment. Meaning, you could have asked the question on really this whole chapter. We keep saying, and when you do the action commandment, you are subsumed in the commandment. You're only just the facilitator of the commandment. This is a pure revelation of God's will. That's why there's a box on your doorpost. That's why you eat this type of meat and you don't buy that one and this spice and not that one. And you put your spices on napkins to check if there's bugs. You do all these funny things that we just sort of take for granted because God has a will and I'm doing it. But we could say, wait a minute. How is this happening when there's this whole barrier inside you of your evil inclination, of your animal soul? How can there be no obstruction for the light of God on your body? I was saying this is why there's no obstruction. Since the animal soul, it's not just like as we simplistically thought, well, two kings fighting it out and then one wins and the other sulking in a corner. No, two kings fighting it out and then one wins and grabs the other and is making him part of the process. So since the animal soul is part of the process, the highest level, the power becomes godly. The next level, that more intellectual, higher plane, is sort of unwittingly there, unwillingly there, and the core went to sleep. So there's no obstruction. There's no barrier. There's nothing to prevent the oneness of God shining on the body of man for the duration of the commandment. Dehainu, me to say, that the power of the vital soul, which is engarbed in the commandment, again, your power, your godly power of thought, to your animal soul's power of thought, that's what we're talking about now, to your human power of thought, your godly power of action, to your animal soul's power of action, that's what we're referring to your human power of action, it's engarbed in the commandment. Hu nichla mamish b'or havaya. That power of the animal soul is literally part of God's light. It's totally fused. It's one with the whole process. It's one with all this godly experience. And through this, it draws down a radiance, a ray, a glow to the entire animal soul as it extends throughout the whole body. As we just said, the animal soul is in your heart, is in your blood. Your blood is throughout your body. Your animal soul is throughout your body. And that entire animal soul is perfumed by this process, is affected by this process because her power is facilitating this whole experience. And on the physical body herself. In this encompassing a way from above. From the top to the bottom of your body, meaning when you do a commandment, the part of the body invested in the commandment is part of the commandment. So your hand is part of God's light now. Your brain cells are part of God's light. Your ears, your power of hearing, your speech is part of God's light. But what's happening to the rest of you? So the rest of you, the Rebbe says, like the animal soul, is in an encompassing fashion affected by the experience, not in an inner fashion. The power of the animal soul in an inner fashion is experiencing this. The hand, the eyes, the body parts doing the action in an inner fashion are experiencing this. But the rest of the body and the totality of the animal soul entity herself in an encompassing fashion are getting this light. So it's not affecting it as deeply, but it's an impact. Now, that's a pretty intense statement to say. Of course, we rely on the Alter Rebbe completely, but he's backing himself up now with some proofs, because it's pretty intense to say, and when you're studying Torah, your animal soul is actually affected by this experience. And when you're like, really? My animal soul? The enemy? So the Rebbe says, yeah, that's what's written. This is a Kabbalistic quote. The divine presence rests on his head. Al daika, specifically on, meaning encompassing, around, not within, but on, in an overarching peripheral way. V'chein, and also, whenever there's a gathering of 10 Jews, the divine presence rests. So again, that quote is a very powerful concept here, because we didn't say whenever 10 Jews are gathered to study, are gathered in prayer, are gathered to do good deeds, social services. No, there's 10 Jews playing cards. And yet the divine presence is in a peripheral way around this assemblage, because there's so much godly energy there. So we see from these two quotations, from these two proof texts, that yes, in a peripheral way, God is on our bodies, not only the part serving God, on the whole body. And even in a situation where you're not serving God, God's presence can be on your body. And with that, we conclude the point of this chapter. Now, if you're looking inside, you could say, wait, the chapter's not over. It's not. But from now until the end, we are responding to a question of a skeptic. Not a question I think anyone here would have or would even think of having, but sometimes the Alter Rebbe will respond, refute the questions a skeptic might have. Now, normally that is done in the side notes, as I think we discussed recently. Sometimes that's done in the body of the text, in parentheses. And here, if you look inside, it's not in a side note, and it's not even parenthetical. But for the rest of the chapter, for the remaining 6 lines, we're responding to a question one could have on this. So before we respond to that question, does anyone here have any questions on any of this or any comments? So the question was, how long does this illumination last? It lasts for the duration of the commandment. If you remember, in the beginning of the chapter, when we first introduced this concept, it was a very long quotation from the Zohar, from the Yenuka, the child of the Zohar. And he was explaining the verse which said that the wise one always, his eyes are on his head. HaChacham einav b'roisho. The wise one, he's always looking at his head to check, is there enough oil? As King Solomon said, Shemen aroshcha al yachzar. Make sure you're not lacking any oil on your head. Make sure there's always commandments being done, because if the oil's not there, the flame of God is going to leave the wick of man. Now, the good news is there are certain commandments that we could say last forever, but that we're always doing. But not necessarily are those commandments action commandments. But the fact that we always have these commandments helps us always have on some level a relationship with God. Of course, in this chapter, we're focusing on the action commandments because of this very special level we enjoy. But for example, an action commandment done to a baby boy called a circumcision, that light lasts his entire life. It says that King David was in the bathhouse. He was like, oh my gosh, I'm naked of commandments. I can't do anything godly here. I'm not allowed to. I'm not allowed to think about God. I'm not allowed to study. I'm not allowed to pray. I'm not allowed to compose psalms. I can't do anything godly here. I'm not allowed to. Oh, but I have my circumcision. I'm always connected to God. So that really expresses this idea that even though he was probably circumcised quite a number of years before, but as long as the commandment lasts, you're serving God. For example, someone just gave an example of modesty. When you're dressed modestly, specifically, again, which of course, to be modest, we are very specifically focused. There's the collarbones, there's the elbows, there's the knees. It's not too form-fitting, it's not too flashy. I mean, we have to have a lot of focus, right? It wasn't accidentally that these clothes wound up in our closet. So when we're dressed modestly, the action happened when we got dressed, But the duration of that commandment is as long as you're dressed in those modest clothing. When one gets married as God wants, that's a commandment. The commandment lasts as long as the marriage lasts. So that is a very beautiful and powerful thought, that the duration of God's energy lasts for the duration of the commandment. If one lights the Shabbos candles and they buy those extra long candles to beautify the commandment with and beautify the Shabbos with those very huge jumbo candles, well, guess what? The light is lasting as long as those candles are burning. So yes, there are definitely, the light is as long as the commandment lasts, and some commandments last for a lifetime. And some commandments last less, and some commandments last more. You did the commandment of the mezuzah, as long as the mezuzah is kosher, as long as there's no cracks in it, as long as the letters aren't faded or chipped, that energy is there, as long as it's a kosher mezuzah. So it's an amazing thing that God's energy will last as long as the commandment lasts.